So why don't we get started? Just so everybody understands, I'm going to do a little introduction. We'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will go right into questions. I'll also do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So welcome everyone to CSR Talent Group's first expert roundtable discussion, focusing on developing and refining your ESG strategy. We're pleased to have you join us for the next hour, and we hope you'll walk away with some practical ideas and insights that help you move your ESG strategy forward. For context and background, CSR Talent Group was started to help companies access ESG and CSR experts to achieve their social impact goals. We recognize that the demands on companies continue to increase, but the options for finding experts, and in particular specialists, was pretty limited. And as the demand for ESG has exploded across nearly every industry, we're committed to helping companies remove the barriers that are preventing them from moving forward. We recognize that the ESG leaders have limited time and resources, so we partner with them to find the right talent that meets their budget. Rebecca, Tim, and Michael are perfect representatives of the over 150 ESG and CSR experts in our network, former in-house ESG and CSR professionals, and veteran consultants who have helped dozens of companies on a range of projects, including projects such as ESG strategy, materiality assessments, ESG communications, employee engagement programs, and many, many more. And unlike many webinars that offer insights from one company or one consulting firm, our experts are bringing a range of experience and approaches to the discussion today. So we hope you'll enjoy that and benefit from that. Rebecca Leonard has deep corporate leadership experience in CSR communications and marketing. And as a consultant, she's led ESG strategy development in multiple industries, including consumer goods, healthcare, technology, and professional services. Tim McClimon has over 30 years of corporate CSR experience and led ESG strategy development at American Express and AT&T, and now leads ESG strategy development through his consulting firm, the Celeste Group. Michael Carren has significant corporate CSR and ESG experience at Fortune 200 companies, including Guardian Life Insurance, JP Morgan Chase, Chrysler Financial, and Capital One. As a consultant, he's led ESG strategy development, materiality assessments, and reporting processes for several companies in the last 3 years. So just a few housekeeping items before we start. We asked you all to submit questions before the webinar, so we have a number of questions for the panelists already. But we also encourage you to send us questions via the chat function. Feel free to do that at any point. We'll try to get to them all. We're not using hand raising, so use the chat function to get us the question. Finally, we're recording the session for those who wanted to attend, but schedules didn't permit. So if you know somebody who might be interested in the webinar, let them know or have them connect with us and we can send them a recording. So let's get started. I'll ask each panelist to provide a little bit of additional background on their career, and then we'll move right into the questions. So Rebecca, let's start with you. Do you mind giving us a little bit more of your background?
Sure. So I was in a house in different leadership roles, brand management, communications, community relations. The list is long, for about 20 years before becoming a consultant. So now for the last 3 years, have been consulting through the Purposeful Projects Group, where I'm managing principal. It's a consortium of all professionals with ESG backgrounds, from in-house, lawyers, government affairs professionals, communicators, investor relations professionals, that we come together to solve, whatever challenge that a specific client needs. All women-owned businesses. So that is what I'm doing now, along with being a teaching fellow and executive advisor at the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, which is a thought leadership center in their School of Management.
That's great. Thank you so much. Tim, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for having me join you today. And thanks to everyone who's participating on the Zoom call. I think you hit the high points of my career. I spent a lot of years at American Express, and welcome Richard Brown if you're on the phone here, my former colleague at American Express, but also worked in CSR at AT&T. I have my own consulting business now where we both work with both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. So a lot of my work right now is with not-for-profit organizations, and I'm actually running a nonprofit theater company, an off-Broadway theater company in New York, as well as the executive director. So while I do have that corporate experience, I've got the nonprofit experience, and I know there are some nonprofit folks on the call with us today. So if you have any questions that are specific about nonprofits, I'd be happy to look at those.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. It's great to have that range of experience in both companies and nonprofits. Very helpful. Mike.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm glad to be here, gratified to be able to share insights that I have around the topic today. As you summarized, I've been an in-house professional for many years. I started in this profession before we had the alphabet soup that was CSR, ESG, DEI. None of those things were actually in existence. It was strategic, whatever they wanted to call it at the time. So I really kind of grew up and have seen the evolution of ESG inside of large companies, from startup in many cases. Similar to Tim, I also have a lot of experience in non-for-profits, both as a consultant, but also an executive leader. So I look forward to the discussion and the questions that we have today. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. Well, thanks, everybody. So let's get into the questions. And I'm going to start with this first one. It's sort of a multi-pronged question. From your experience in a company and as a consultant, what have you seen high-performing companies do that ensures they have a strong and successful ESG strategy and approach? What are the things that the companies with successful ESG strategies do well? And what are the common barriers to success? So you can come at that from any of those angles, but Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
Sure. We're going to hear the word integration from the three of us probably quite a lot. But, so people talk about successful strategies in ESG being integrated ones. And what I would say, companies that are successful understand that integration happens at a lot of different levels. There's the obvious one with their business strategy. There's also the idea of, their strategy has to be aligned with their existing business processes. If you try to create something and the organization is literally built to go another direction, it will impede your strategy. Their culture, it has to be integrated with your culture. If you take a strategy in a direction that people don't feel is in alignment with their culture, it's very difficult to get them aligned with moving it forward. And then finally, I think successful companies understand that integration happens across ESG issues. ESG is not a function. It's not a thing. It is a number of things that, when it's done really, really well, come together so that a company can make informed decisions to move their overall objectives forward. And those ESG factors come into that decision making. So that's what I'd say successful companies do really, really well.
Great. So integration, understanding the culture, enterprise-wide approaches, sounds like all makes sense. Tim, you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. Since Rebecca started with an I word, integration, I'll use another I word, which is inclusion. I think that successful companies are inclusive in the development of their strategies. So whether those stakeholders are external stakeholders or internal stakeholders, I think the more inclusive your approach with those stakeholders, whether they're frontline employees or executives, your CEO, your board, the media, the public, your customers, I think you should be engaging all of those various stakeholders in the planning process. And once you do that, then, you'll develop a strategy that is integrated into your, business strategy and is integrated into your community strategy, and will have something that makes sense both externally and internally. So I would use the inclusive or inclusion I word.
Okay, that's great. So including a broad range of stakeholders in the process. That makes sense. Mike, you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely right. It's around business integration, and I can't stress enough what Rebecca said about ESG not being a thing, but an approach, a strategy, a way to work. And of course, inclusion is important. I'm going to add one more I, which is introspection, and that for me is important because my experience has been that when many companies go into this process of building out a strategy, they're not necessarily open to self-discovery. And you do unearth a lot of difficult and hard truths that they have to somehow figure out how they want to address. That's from stakeholders, but that's also from other regulators and others. And so I think that commitment to self-discovery and building self-awareness and learning is extraordinarily important. And I'm also going to add, because you asked in your question about a barrier.
Yeah.
And so one of the barriers that I've seen in looking at ESG strategy development within companies is once you start to identify those issues that are material, or those stakeholders that could help you find those issues that are material to your ESG work, that companies will often dismiss uncomfortable issues and try to focus on those things that they can affect most easily, or that are in flight. And that necessarily hurts inclusion, that necessarily hurts integration, and it certainly hurts introspection in terms of self-discovery.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so there's really the introspection and dismissing uncomfortable issues is one of the barriers that a lot of companies face. What about misconceptions about ESG strategy? As one of you said, I think it was you, Mike, about the alphabet soup here. ESG is sort of the new name for everything right now. Do people come into the ESG strategy process with misconceptions about what it is, what it means, what should come out of this? And let's go backwards. Let's go in reverse order this time. Mike, I'll start with you.
Sure. So again, I'll say what Rebecca said, ESG is not a thing. So that's a misconception. And we can talk about that for hours if we wanted to. I won't go into it terribly deeply. Another misconception that I see, and this happens across industries, is that ESG is primarily about risk management and not opportunity. And that's a terrible way to look at it, because you're really excluding almost half of your company in many cases when you're looking at it only in terms of risk management. And then I think the last misconception is that only C-suite members and members of boards need to be educated on what ESG is. In order for an integrated strategy to work really well, you need to have an understanding as to why, for the sake of what is the company doing this. What are the opportunities and the risks that they're trying to address, but moreover, how are they going to integrate across, and why are they doing that? Why are we asking human resources to work with product development, to work with procurement? And I think that's a real big misconception, is that only the folks up the chain need to be educated. It's really the entire organization, in order to set the process and the commitment on everybody to be a contributor to that strategy development.
And that's something, just to follow up on that education is a process that you often use when you're developing the ESG strategy. That's sort of one of the front end things that you use in your approach.
Yeah, I know. I try to find out what the company is defining as ESG right up front, and oftentimes what I find is that the way the company is just defining it leaves off a number of factors that I try to thoughtfully provoke them to consider.
Yeah.
And then help them to understand that this education is not about the basics of ESG, but rather the value that's added to the company. So that process of discovery has to happen right up front.
Yeah, got it. Tim, you want to add anything to the misconception discussion?
Yeah. I think that a common misperception is that it has to be a new thing, that what the company does or what the nonprofit does has to be something new. And actually, I think the most successful ESG strategies are actually a repackaging of things that the company is already doing, and that is they're already committed. too. So it might result in some new projects or new activities or new commitments, but I think many companies and nonprofits are already doing a lot that would fall into the ESG framework. They just don't think about it that way. And I particularly get this from nonprofits when I talk to them about ESG is they say, oh, we don't have any money. We can't possibly do anything new, or we don't have the time to do anything new. When in reality, they're actually already doing a lot of things that make their organizations more environmentally friendly, or that support their communities, or that promote good governance practices, just, to use some examples. So I think it's that trying to get a mindset around repackaging some things that they're already doing, putting different labels on them, perhaps, and organizing them in different ways, but it doesn't have to be a bunch of new things. It can be really taking a look at things that they're already doing and doing successfully.
Yeah, I want to come back to that concept in a minute, but let's Rebecca, I'd love to hear from you about the misconceptions.
Yeah, so yes to everything that Mike and Tim have said. And I just want to note, like, we see the same misconceptions come up again and again, and the same barriers come up again in 3 different consulting practices. The positive of that for people who are considering going through a process is that we know how to deal with them because we have seen them over, and you're not alone. So I hope everybody takes that message. You won't be alone if you feel like you're facing those barriers, because you're not. So, and then the other thing I would say about misconceptions, and I'll kind of wrap all of this that everyone has said up in a bow with a really tactical thing and a really philosophical thing. One is that you are going to come out of the ESG strategy planning process with a piece of paper. Yes, you will come out with pieces of paper, but that's nothing but a representation of where you are at that moment in time. Yeah. It's more than that. And if that's your only goal, then you've missed the point of the exercise. And that brings me to a philosophical side of it, is that the misconception is, again, that there's like, it's some kind of thing that happens and gets put on a piece of paper or gets written or a committee gets formed, and that's it. It is a change management process. People don't understand that the strategy development process, particularly in these spaces where there is no end game, the end game is a perfect world and a perfect planet. That means that it is a continuous change management process, and it has to be considered that way.
Okay.
That's absolutely right.
Tim, you mentioned this, that a lot of companies may be doing ESG already, and they need to repackage or upgrade it to a certain extent. I'd love for each of you to talk a little bit about. I know that you've gone into companies that are doing a bunch of things, and they've been told that they have to have an ESG strategy, and they may have some level of a strategy in place already. How do you help them think about what is technically ESG versus CSR versus anything else in the alphabet soup? Especially if they're at the beginning of their, early in their sort of path, their journey around, I'll say broadly, corporate citizenship. What's the distinction that you help them understand? And when you're doing the education with the different stakeholders and they're wondering what this all means, how do you talk about ESG versus what they've been doing already and what they've been doing in the past? And Tim, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it can be a struggle at the beginning because of the nomenclature ESG. So I think trying to define ESG in the simplest terms possible. Like I really always try to keep it simple, and just in a very basic way, talk about the environment, talk about good governance, talk about commitment to community, talk about commitment to employees, and try to do that in a way that they're already doing a lot of these kinds of things. They may already have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They may already have workplace policies in place. They may already be doing recycling or tracking their carbon footprint or whatever it is. So I think that trying to understand that corporations and nonprofits want to be good citizens. They're probably already doing things that help them be good citizens. And so I try to get past all the, the standards and the technicalities and the materiality assessments and all of those things that can be really, really helpful, but they can also get in the way of just a basic understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish here. So try to keep it high level, try to keep it simple, try to get over the technicalities that can be, can enter into the picture. I mean, just take materiality assessments, for instance. I mean, I've done materiality assessments and they can be really, really complicated, or they can be really, really simple. I've done materiality assessments with organizations that have been done in a very simple kind of way, and others can take months to accomplish. So I think that trying to read the culture of the organization and read where they are in their own particular journeys and how open they are to these processes, and just trying to keep it as simple as possible.
Okay. I want to come back to that materiality assessment point, because I know a lot of people struggle with what level of materiality assessment do they need, if at all. But Rebecca, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this ESG distinction or differentiation compared to what companies are already doing.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, because every company is going to be different. The thing that I would say in terms of things that happen often in companies when they kind of go from this, and I'm going to use these terms because I think to some degree they're jargon, but citizenship perspective to an ESG perspective is traditionally citizenship has been, whether it should have been or not, we can debate all day long, but looking at all the positive things you do, community giving, and like you said, recycling programs, there's good things that we do. I would argue it has always been about really taking a hard look, to Mike's point, about your positive and negative impacts and deciding what you're going to do about those. But I think ESG is, really because of the standards and frameworks that exist, because of regulation happening around the world and pending here in the US, there is a absolute requirement to look at the positive and negative implications of your business. I also think, looking at your impact on society, but also, again, going to bring it up again, integration into your business strategy and your decision-making. How are you considering material issues in your decision-making so that your business is sustainable and that we have sustainable society? That to me is the difference.
Got it. Okay. And I want to come back to the standards and the reporting requirements, because obviously we hear a lot of those questions. Which one should we use? Which one should we be aligning with? So we'll come back to that. But Mike, would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Something that is often a difficult message to land with companies, but nonetheless something important to remind them of, is that CSR is necessarily a function of enlightened self-interest. And that's when you can control the story the most, right? Because you're out there doing good things, at least you think you are doing good things. ESG is also a function of enlightened self-interest, but it's on both sides of the coin. So there are things that you're going to have control over as a company, and every company, as you know, likes control. And there are some things that are going to be out of your control, and you have to understand, to Rebecca's point, that this is a process. So I know we're going to get to materiality assessments and standards and the like at the beginning, but this is evolutionary, right, in companies. Yeah. So to Tim's point, making this as direct, understandable, simple, and able to be embraced by companies as to what they're doing right now is a very important thing. And I'm a big believer that if you start a materiality assessment from scratch, if you've never done one, it should be very simple, direct, and straightforward. And then you should make a commitment after you have that and you start to build that roadmap to what you want to do, that you make that commitment to refresh that materiality assessment on another level as you go forward and you become more savvy.
Yeah.
So that's how I try to break it down to folks. What I do see, last thing I'll say about this question is, I often see internal dynamics where, and I speak as, you know, a proud former CSR professional, where that proud former CSR professional also wants to own ESG, right? Or wants to own DEI. And there's this endless debate that goes back and forth between, is CSR DEI or is DEI CSR? And I hate that debate because it's derivative of anything. So, you know, one of the things that I think is really, really important is that the ownership is across the enterprise. And of course, you have to have champions, but you have to have multiple champions. And you have to take an evolutionary approach to this. You're not going to do a materiality assessment, build a strategy, and then have an ESG platform forever and ever.
So I want to take that and go into the standards and the return on investment discussion too. So when, and this sort of ties into how you engage senior leaders and get people on board. What do you guys see as the real ROIs for this process? What do companies expect? What do they want to realize from establishing an ESG framework and strategy? And then sort of a related question is, if you could talk for a minute without going into too much depth about each standard or framework, SASB, GRI, TCFD, whatever it is, or Dow Jones Sustainability Index, what do you see as, so coupled with the ROIs, are there certain standards that you see a lot of companies aligning with, or are ones rising to the top that companies should be paying attention to? And Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Sure. So, you know, I think GRI is the one that people pay most attention to at this point, because it's extraordinarily intricate, and it's also tailored to individual industries. And it's kind of a la carte. You can sort of select the things that you want, and companies tend to feel more comfortable with that. But they are under pressure from other pieces that are not within their control. So rating agencies is an example. MSCI is a great example. They take publicly extracted data, and then they formulate a readout on your ESG performance as a company.
Right.
And so that means that you have to get ahead of that and have to figure out what you really want to participate in, how comfortably. So I think, you know, GRI, I think SASB also is something that companies, because it's so much more financially driven, that SASB is something that companies are feel like they're good at, and they can make disclosures around. So those are the ones that I see rising to the top. But there's going to be an endless, I mean, there's already movement, as everybody on this panel knows. There's already a great deal of movement to trying to standardize ESG standards, right? To try to actually get them to normalize a little bit, so that we're not chasing down different pieces and sort of making ESG into a navel-gazing exercise every year for a company. The other thing that you had asked was around the ROIs, right? And again, going to go back to the integration. So if it's a business integrated strategy, there are business ROIs, and you have to discover those. I can't tell you as a consultant what they're going to be, but what I've seen from companies is usually their first point of departure for ROI is, I want to build my reputation, and I want to make sure I'm in compliance with all my regulations. That's just basic. This is what I want the return on this to be. The second thing that I see is, and this is in more select companies, that they see ESG strategy development, roadmap development as a process that can spur innovation, which I think is really good, even market expansion in some cases. And then finally, ones who are really good at this that I've worked with really see the process as a return on investment, because it provides diversity of thought and representation across the company. And that is related to innovation, but it's also related to cultural commitment. So lots there, from standards to ROIs.
No, that was really helpful. Thanks. Rebecca, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. You know, all of those, I agree that it depends on the company. what the return was. And, you know, it could be any of the things that Mike mentioned. I've also had clients who, you know, in employee engagement, talent attraction is something really significant for their industry. So that can be a primary ROI. And then the other one that I see often is attraction of capital, particularly with, you know, earlier stage companies wanting to go after those, you know, ESG investors. So those are all, you know, it depends. And I would say a good materiality assessment is going to have, if they don't know already what is in their business strategy related to ESG, a good materiality assessment can help uncover that. You know, introspection and talking to people internally, talking to external stakeholders can help to uncover what is possible, both in terms of mitigating risk and finding opportunity for value creation.
Okay. Tim, how about you?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a lot to add to that, although I appreciate the fourth I word, innovation there, Michael. So thank you for that. But, you know, I think that I'll just say that for nonprofits, it's different, right? So nonprofits don't have the same kind of reporting requirements, you know, with ESG. I mean, nonprofits that are interested in this are doing it because they have a stakeholder, or they could be a college, university, and their students are interested in ESG and want to be more environmentally friendly, or maybe they have a funder, a foundation or a funder that's interested in this work, and they want the organization to put more structure around what it is that they do. So I think from a nonprofit standpoint, it's not so much about reporting standards as it is about just communications, like how do they communicate with their various stakeholders, and how do they organize the things that they're doing around these concepts so that they communicate, you know, effectively to their stakeholders. And I think that the primary barrier there is similar to a lot of for-profit companies, and this is something that Michael had mentioned earlier, and that's that, you know, a lot of nonprofits don't want to communicate to their stakeholders that they may not be accomplishing something in the way that they've set out. So that this idea of setting goals and then reporting on your progress or lack of progress toward those goals is very difficult, I think, not only for for-profit companies, but especially for nonprofits who rely on contributions and on people's goodwill, for them to get, you know, over the concept of it's all right to have a goal and report on your progress toward that goal. You know, that can be a difficult communications challenge, but I think it can really differentiate nonprofits from one another. And you know, and help them in the way that they communicate with those stakeholders.
Okay.
Tom, can I add one thing? Because I did.
Yeah, please feel free.
The standards and frameworks. You know, when I do a materiality assessment, I use the standards frameworks, look at things like, you know, MSCI or ISS indicators to help define the universe of issues. But once you come out with, you know, what you're trying to achieve, what your stakeholder viewpoints are, and what your material issues are, you start to also, that can you know, what frameworks are the right ones to use, either to help inform how you're measuring performance internally, or how you are determining how to disclose your performance, because those are not the same thing. You know, it isn't as terrible. Maybe it's because we live and breathe it, but it's not as terrible as everybody thinks. You start to, you know, there's some really obvious things. If you're in certain sectors with high energy use and emissions, well, guess what? Like, you know, people are going to, I am sure you've heard from an investor or some key stakeholder that there is an expectation around reporting to TCFD. And that said, TCFD, you know, you may not disclose everything that but it will also, that is a great framework to helping you find your pathway forward. And then similar, Mike mentioned GRI. I love GRI because even if you don't disclose everything, it forces such a tough look at everything that's happening in your organization that in terms of an inventory and a, understanding of where you sit so that, whatever you choose out of all of those indicators where you want to go, it just really helps you say, well, I'm here, I want to go there. And like, it shortcuts the metrics for you. So they're really, people talk about the standards and frameworks as the worst things in the world, and they can be a little painful at times. But I mean, I think that they are incredibly useful for a number of strategic, and communications exercises. And it's sometimes there more than one is because that more than one is going to give you different value. GRI is going to give you completely different value than SASB, no question about it.
And I think this is what I've seen in projects too with through CSR Talent Group is a consultant can bring that perspective and guidance and a little bit of hand holding around the confusion maybe, or the misunderstanding or the lack of education around the different standards and frameworks. So that makes total sense. Let me expand on that a little bit, or go in a little bit of a different direction and start with you, Rebecca, since you're on the subject. Let's talk about the G of ESG, because I think people understand the E and the S fairly well and maybe doing a lot in those spaces. But can you all talk about how companies approach or don't approach governance in the ESG planning, and what do they usually miss about the scope of governance in their planning?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to start, Rebecca?
Governance is such a big word. And I think, where it can get confusing in an ESG strategy development process is that it comes into play with different meanings. There is a good strategy development process has its own governance. The project has its own governance. And that oftentimes it has always been surprising to me how often a company, I'll say, let's pause in a reporting project or materiality assessment at the very beginning and say, let's set up the governance. And then let's make sure that all of our internal stakeholders are aligned on how we're, who's coming, what their roles, responsibilities, decision-making processes, all of these things. And they're like, are we going to do that? And I'm like, yeah, we're going to spend some time doing that. Like, it's really, really critical because you will get hung up over and over and over again in this process if you don't set up governance for the process. And then there is governance around ESG. Again, how are those decisions made? How, are you going to have a committee? You don't want to set up a committee and then not say, this is how the committee will function and how they will be held accountable for how well they function. That's a critical piece. So that is, and I think that's happening in a lot of companies right now. And then of course, there's the third governance, big G, which is corporate governance, and all of the myriad of issues, processes, policies that come under. So that's why I think it can be, people can get confused, is because the word governance comes into the process and it means many different things according to what you're actually trying to achieve as part of the work.
But just to follow up on that, and maybe Mike, you can take this if you want, the integration part, the governance of the process and then of ESG. I mean, you're essentially talking about how to make the governance around ESG become integrated into the regular governance structure of the company. Is that how you're thinking about it? And
well, I would hope so. Yeah, I mean, because if you have a governance process outside of the regular governance process in the company, it's going to be relatively meaningless. The thing that I see that a lot of companies do is that they look, to Rebecca's point, they look at governance as a top-down thing. It's about the board and it's about the C-suite. And if the board and the C-suite have a dashboard that has material ESG issues across the top and progress to addressing those across the side, then that's being governed. But that falls down because what a lot of companies don't think about and are facing a lot of issues. Technology companies, for example, are facing data privacy, data ownership issues.
Yeah.
How is data management governed within the lines of business? How are products developed so that they're free of bias? within the business. And so the governance really has to, it has to flow down in a way that's meaningful for each of the sort of verticals that are acting on the ESG action plan, right?
Yeah.
And that's not something that you can do top down. You can't, as a CEO, declare, you shall have a governance process. It's a process of discovery for product developers. It's a process of discovery for customer service. It's for marketing, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think that, by the way, the last thing I'll say about governance is it's probably the least standardized piece in any sort of standard that we're using, right? So there's a lot of room to decide what governance is, and governance is not necessarily about power and accountability. Who holds the accountability and who has the power to hold others accountable. So it can be very, very difficult, but I often see it just happen. Okay, we're just going to punt it to the C-suite. If they're happy, we're happy.
Yeah.
And that's not, that it's much deeper.
Yeah, I'm curious, feel free to add to this, but also I'm curious about how the governance structure evolved at Amex while you were there, because you were there for quite a while. I'm sure the governance piece became a lot more sophisticated and integrated into the business there. Any thoughts about that, or things you want?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, would agree with everything that Rebecca and Michael have said, but I would disagree with something you said, Tom, and that's that, at least from my experience, actually companies and nonprofits actually understand governance more, better than they do environmental and social issues. They've had more experience with governance. It's taught in business schools. There's the corporate secretary's office that's promoting good governance practices, or nonprofits have the Better Business Bureau and the Wise Giving Alliance and the independent sector, and all of these organizations or watchdog groups that have promoted good governance practices. So they may not be doing it, but they understand what they should be doing. They understand the concept of good governance. So I think sometimes actually it's easier to start with governance and explore how organizations are currently governed and what kinds of practices they're already engaged in. I think that, to answer your question about Amex, I think every organization goes through an evolution in their governance, which to get at Michael's point, is just much more inclusive now than it once was. This top-down approach to governance, which used to work very effectively for organizations, just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
In our environment, and employees are not interested in joining firms or organizations that have that kind of top-down approach. They want to be participants in the process. There's just much more interest in these kinds of social issues amongst the sort of rank and file employees than there used to be. And I think that they're feeling their power, right? I mean, their employees are feeling their power. Just look at the whole hybrid work situation, where companies want them to come back to work and they're just saying no. I come back to the office and they're saying no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And if I have to do it, I'll go someplace else. So I think that companies have come to adopt a much more open, inclusive governance structure, and that certainly happened at American Express and is continuing to happen. So I think that's a positive, and I think that that's something that actually companies and nonprofits should talk about in their ESG strategies, about the way that they get feedback from their stakeholders, respond to that feedback, how they let them participate in the governance of not only their ESG strategies, but their organization. So I think it's all an evolutionary process. I think it's all been positive for companies like Amex, but I do think that the ideas of governance are in a way easier to understand for a lot of organizations than the nitty-gritty of environmental policies and carbon accounting and DEI work and pay equity and all of these things that can be much more complex.
That's a good point. Well, you're talking about this trend of companies being more inclusive around governance, and would love to hear, and I'll start with you, Tim. You guys have been in the space for a fair amount of time, and I'd love to hear what you see as trends, not just trends, but important trends that companies should be looking at or understanding or paying attention to around ESG specifically. Are there?
Yeah, well, we've talked about some of them already. One of them is this kind of standardization of ESG strategies, or I think as Michael referred to as the normalization of ESG strategies, which have come about because of all of these standards. I think that's, in a way, it's a little unfortunate. I mean, I do understand why it's happened and why investors are pushing companies to be more standardized so that they can compare one company against the other. But I think it's, unfortunately, what's happened is that the first question that companies ask now is, what are our competitors doing? And then they want to do the exact same thing. They want to do the same thing as their competitors. They want to be part of the pack. They don't want to be different because if they're different, then they can be singled out in their industry. And so I think where CSR strategies often promoted the idea of differentiation, now I think there's much more standardization. And that's certainly a trend, and you can debate whether that's a positive or negative trend. I think it makes the work less interesting when it's all standardized than when there was more emphasis on differentiation. But I do think that there's this homogenization of ESG strategies where they all have to look the same now. The second thing I would mention is just the scrutiny that companies and nonprofits are under, that are now coming from all sides of the political spectrum. So it's not just the leftist activists. Now it's the people on the right of the political spectrum that are actually being more vocal in their criticism of companies in their ESG strategies. So whether it's J.D. Vance or Governor DeSantis or Mike Pence or even Elon Musk, there's a lot of criticism out there of companies, and I think that is causing issues in companies when you're getting it from all sides, and I think it makes companies squeamish when it comes to these issues. That there's no right way, and that whatever you do is going to upset somebody, which to me leads to the third issue that we've already talked about a little bit, and that's this rising voice of employees and stakeholders in a way is kind of making CEOs less powerful, and they're in a way losing their voice, if you will, that they're even though there's a lot of pressure on CEOs to take stands and to be vocal. I think that what you're seeing now is less of that activity. You saw more of it for a while, but now I think you're seeing less of that activity as it becomes much more difficult for companies to take these stands or to come out in front of issues. And so one of the things that I've seen recently is CEOs, letting somebody else in their organizations do that. Letting their chief communications officer or their diversity, equity, and inclusion officer or the human resource officer or somebody else make announcements or have their name on press releases. So it's not always the CEO who's taking the heat. It's somebody. The heat is now being dispersed, amongst the organization. And I think that's just a result of the scrutiny that companies are under.
No, that makes sense. So standardization, scrutiny, and the transferring from the CEO to others within the company as spokespeople and representatives. It's interesting. Rebecca, you want to weigh in on that, or any other trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. So, I've seen a lot of the same things. Maybe I think my take on it is a little bit different. So like I agree there's a homogenization of issues being addressed in ESG strategies. That's because, in an industry, your impacts are going to be largely the same. If you have differentiation in the issues you're selecting, then you're probably not addressing your impacts. Like if you're both selling blouses, well, you're both selling blouses and you're manufacturing them, and the issues that you're going to encounter are going to be the same. I will say, like, probably my different perspective is, and maybe this is from years in a communications background, is what it is affording is an opportunity to differentiate in the way you're addressing them. I think there is a creative opportunity in how you're addressing them. Just a super quick example is I work with two apparel manufacturers. They are both dealing with human rights, but one is really focusing on empowering women in the labor force globally. The other one is looking at global indigenous peoples and how they can lift that up through incorporation into design. Two completely different approaches, both are awesome, but quite different. So I love the creativity that it's almost the homogenization of issue selection is forcing companies into, because I think that is actually a real opportunity to differentiate as you address issues. I agree that the role of regulation has definitely increased, the goal is to increase transparency, which, there is an element of risk and transparency, and I think there's a definite recognition in that. So I agree with that. I will say that I have heard some people say, oh, this is going to be, ESG will be the purview of legal and compliance, and it is going to be I don't agree with that at all. That's like saying finance sits in the finance department, and it doesn't incorporate, the legal department and the communicators and the investor relations folks. And, again, it keeps coming up. ESG is not a thing that you can put in a drawer and then take out when you need to take it out. It is a pervasive strategy or approach or perspective on the way you run your company and the impacts that it creates. And then, I agree that I think the other thing just to call out, which is really obvious, you mentioned it, Tom, at the beginning, is the prominence of ESG in the business conversation. It's just, it's explosive in terms of how many people are looking at it, how many, if everything goes through in the SEC as required with 2025 scope 3, not just the impact on public companies, but private companies and their supply chains as well, is going to be significant. So it is something that needs to be addressed by more companies than ever before. And, it's the reason we all sit here and, and show up to work every day, because there's just, this is just not a conversation to this degree a few years ago.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Mike, any thoughts about the trends or anything you've heard? Rebecca,
there's a lot that Tim and Rebecca both shared that is absolutely right. Those trends are all out there. I guess the one overarching, I'm going to be really simplistic here, and this may sound like a DEI thing, but it's not. And I'll just use one word: equity. This has to do with stakeholder equity, customer equity, employee equity. And that is a huge trend. And I think that underlies a lot of the pending regulations that we're going to be seeing coming down. But it doesn't address the issue of equity in any sort of definable way. It tasks the companies with coming up with what their definition of equity is. And to Tim's point, that's where you can start to get into a lot of crosstalk from various different places on the political spectrum. But I think that if companies are not thinking about that in terms of ESG strategy, coupled with their innovation and their desire to innovate, then there's going to be a lot of liability that's out there, not just because they acted in a wrong way or a right way, but because of the perceptions of their inaction.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a huge trend. It's a trend in all of our society, but as you think about an integrated business strategy like ESG, it is in my mind, top of the list about what are the considerations that we have to do. Because if you're not, for instance, if you're not aware of your market, you might be designing products that are necessarily exclusionary. And they can be exclusionary not just based on zip code or ethnicity or gender or race or anything like that. They can be exclusive just because of the way that they're engineered. And let's be clear, some products are designed to be exclusive,
Right.
but not all of them. And particularly in many industries like technology, finance, those are not things that really go down very well if you don't have an equitable product mix across your platforms.
Got it. Well, we've got a few minutes left. I'd love to go around the room and give you 30 seconds, not much more, just to say anything that we've missed or any final points you want to make that would be helpful for our corporate members here. Is there a final recommendation, issue that we should be paying attention to, they should be paying attention to? Anything you want to say, just to wrap it up. Rebecca, let's start with you.
Oh gosh, that's a lot of pressure, Tom.
Yeah. You can handle it, I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, if this is something that your company, no matter where you are, if you're really starting to think about a strategy for the first time, or you're looking to refresh it, think about, the thing I would be thinking about is who do I need to bring to the party, to the point of it, if you want integration, if you want a successful strategy, which does involve not just what you decide is on the paper, but the structure, the people, the power processes, all of these different things,
Yeah.
you need to think about who you're going to bring to the party.
Okay. Tim?
Yeah, I would just say, and Michael alluded to this earlier, but just get started. Just start the process.
Yeah.
You don't have to go from 0 to 100 the first year. You can take baby steps along the way, but the first thing, you just have to get started. You got to do something. Don't be afraid. Just get started. Hire a consultant to help you, or take somebody that's internal that knows how to do strategy work, and just get started. That's my advice.
Okay, good advice. Mike, you have the last word here.
Well, first, I want to thank Tom, you and CSR Talent Group for organizing this. You always do a great job, and I appreciate working with you. So thanks for including me in this. I'm going to say something very similar to what Tim just said. Quoting FDR, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Oftentimes, this is what ESG, because you see all of those factors in there. The fact that ESG funds attracted, I think last year, more capital inflow than any other type of funds. There's pressure from investors, there's pressure from employees, there's pressure from state, and that can be debilitating. But it really is, as we mentioned before, a process of self-discovery and evolution. And so in addition to getting started, making sure that you place the right amount of optimism into the process as you start it, as you possibly can, because that's ultimately going to fuel the rest of the work that you do.
Great. Well, in the chat, we had somebody saying, thanks, everyone. Great insights, and we appreciate all of you taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Couldn't say it any better. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it. In the last minute or so, we've got, for those of you who attended, really appreciate you coming. If there's anything you'd like to learn more about some of the questions that were raised that we didn't get to all the questions in the chat, I apologize for that, but please feel free to follow up with us. And if we'd love to talk to you about CSR Talent Group and the services we provide, wherever you are in your ESG journey, we can help you along the way. And as you've seen today, these experts obviously know a lot about ESG, so you're in good hands if you come to us and you need some help on your ESG strategy or anything else related to ESG. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists. We'll look forward to seeing you all at the next roundtable discussion we have in the next few months. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, bye-bye.